They say the past does not rest. It lingers in the bones of the forgotten, in the dirt of hollowed fields, in the whispers of names erased from family records, and sometimes it emerges not as myth but as fact. What I'm about to tell you is one of those stories, a history buried so deep in shame that those who lived it swore never to let it leave their bloodline. Yet it did. The truth always does. This is not folklore, and it is not exaggeration. This is the story of two brothers, one sister, and the bed they shared in a pact that would forever stain their family tree with the darkest of secrets. A pact that was not born out of love, but of possession, desperation, and an inherited cycle of decay. The American frontier was never just about survival. It was about isolation. A family could vanish into the woods, into the hills, and remain unseen for generations. And within that hidden world, the laws of God and man often fell away, replaced by something much older, something primal. In this family, the sister was not given a choice. She was made to be both wife and property, not to one man, but to her own blood. Two brothers, bound by flesh, bound by blood, decided that no outsider would ever touch her. They locked the doors, they silenced the neighbors, and what happened inside that house became a legacy of horror. But the earth remembers. Generations later, doctors would puzzle over deformities that seemed too precise, too patterned to be mere chance. Children with sunken jaws, eyes that never looked straight, minds clouded by fog before they ever reached adulthood. And when the records were traced, when whispers turned into proof, the truth surfaced. The children all came from the same bed, the same brothers, the same sister, the same sin repeated again and again until the family line bent under its own weight and broke. And yet, the most haunting part is not the act itself. It is the silence that surrounded it, the neighbors who knew but did not speak, the church that looked the other way, the community that chose to forget rather than confront what was happening just beyond the tree line. In their silence, they became part of the story. And in their silence, this family was able to continue, unchecked, for far longer than anyone will ever truly admit. The beginning always hides itself in shadows. No family ever starts with the intention of devouring its own roots. But this one began with a fracture. The parents, too poor to move, too proud to beg, raised their children in a cabin tucked so far back into the hills that the outside world might as well have been another planet. They were cut off from towns, cut off from law, cut off from the lifelines that tether people to morality. Isolation is not just loneliness, it is erosion. Slowly, without the eyes of others, the rules of right and wrong crumble until what is left feels natural, even when it is monstrous. The brothers grew into men with no education, no prospects, no means of building lives of their own. And the sister, she grew into the only woman within reach. She was never courted, never allowed to leave, never given the chance to be anything more than a body caught between two men who decided she would never escape them. At first it was whispered among kin as a temporary sin, something that could be ignored if it stayed hidden. But soon, it became ritual. They lived together as if it were normal, as if God himself had made their union inevitable. And the sister, stripped of agency, bore the weight of her brother's choice. She carried children that belonged to both of them, children who grew up never knowing which man was their father. Imagine the silence in that house. A silence broken only by the cries of infants, the mutter of brothers who spoke of keeping blood pure, and the exhausted breathing of a sister who was more captive than sibling. They justified it to themselves with twisted reasoning, that no outsider could be trusted, that family must remain family. But beneath every justification was the rot of desire and power, an ancient sickness that spread with every birth, every generation. The neighbors, the few who lived close enough to key, now said nothing. Perhaps they pitied, perhaps they feared, perhaps they recognized too much of themselves in the story and chose to turn away. And so the pattern continued. Year after year, the same bed, the same sister, the same children born into a web of lies and secrecy, so thick it seemed indestructible. But secrets are like cracks in stone. Left long enough, they spread, and soon the fractures in this family would grow too wide to contain. By the time the second generation came of age, the damage could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. Children bore the marks of what had been done before them. Strange features, slack jaws, vacant eyes that never quite met another's gaze. Some were born silent, never crying, never taking more than a few breaths. Others lived, but half-lives, their bodies twisted, their minds clouded, their futures already written in their bones. These were not accidents. They were the echoes of a choice made long ago, a choice that demanded payment in the flesh of innocent children. Yet the brothers pressed on, convincing themselves that what they were doing was ordained. They raised those children together, never admitting aloud what everyone knew. The line between father and uncle was gone. There was no line left at all, and still the sister remained at the center, her face pale and hollow, her spirit cracked under the weight of bearing life after life for men who refused to see her as anything but theirs. She was less a woman than a vessel, used, discarded, and yet forced to continue. As years passed, outsiders occasionally stumbled into their world. A peddler, a traveling preacher, a curious neighbor. Some left uneasy, unwilling to put words to what they sensed. Others never returned. Rumors swirled that visitors sometimes vanished near the family's land, and though no proof was ever found, the whispers were enough to keep most away. In that isolation, the cycle deepened. The children of the sister, sons and daughters carrying the blood of both brothers, grew up alongside one another, and when the time came, they too were pushed into the same cycle. Brother to sister, cousin to cousin, every wall fell, every boundary dissolved. The family told themselves it was protection, that outsiders would bring corruption, that the world beyond the hills was diseased and dangerous, but in truth, it was the sickness inside that was spreading, a sickness no one dared confront. What had begun with 2 brothers and 1 sister was now a sprawling, tangled web of kinship and sin, impossible to untangle, impossible to purify. And still, no one intervened. No sheriff rode out, no church sent help. Silence was the family's shield, and in that silence, their empire of decay grew stronger. What makes this story so haunting is not just what was done, but how long it was allowed to continue. By the 3rd generation, the children no longer looked like children from outside families. Their features carried the unmistakable imprint of blood folding in on itself again and again, noses flattened, jaws uneven, eyes that wandered in opposite directions. Some were born unable to walk, others unable to speak. And yet, within the walls of that house, they were raised as though nothing were wrong. The men, the brothers now turned old, grey but still proud, pointed to these children as proof of loyalty, proof that their blood remained unbroken by outsiders. They saw deformity as purity, sickness as strength. The sister, long past her youth, was reduced to little more than a ghost within her own home. By then, she was no longer just a sister, no longer just a mother. She was a grandmother, a matriarch presiding over a tree so tangled it strangled itself. But she was silent, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps because she believed there was no other world left to escape to. The outside world, however, had begun to notice. Doctors in nearby towns saw children who came in for treatment, children who could barely form words, children whose faces bore the unmistakable signature of generations of shared blood. And when asked about family history, the answers were always the same: evasive, half-true, dripping with shame. "We keep to ourselves," they would say. Always have. But medicine does not bow to secrecy. Records were written, patterns were traced, and eventually the story of 2 brothers and 1 sister began to surface. Not as rumor, not as neighborly gossip, but as cold fact. Scientists and social workers alike would later describe it as one of the most extreme cases of generational inbreeding ever uncovered in America, a lineage that seemed less like a family tree and more like a closed loop feeding into itself until it collapsed. And yet, even as the evidence grew undeniable, the community surrounding them still hesitated. Few wanted to confront the truth head-on. Few wanted to say the words aloud, that in the heart of their county, in the hills they passed every day, one of the most disturbing family experiments in human history was unfolding in plain sight. Silence again was easier than confrontation, and so the cycle continued, even as the cost grew higher with every child born into that haunted bloodline. By the fourth generation, the family was no longer living in secrecy by choice. It was because they had no other way left to exist. Their children, marked so visibly by the weight of bloodlines collapsing inward, could not blend into towns or schools. They were pointed at, laughed at, feared. Some were unable to speak clearly, communicating only in strange sounds that outsiders described as animal-like. Others wandered the woods blank-eyed, their movements slow and unnatural. For those who saw them, the image never left their minds. These were not just children born into poverty, they were children born into a curse. And yet, even in this collapse, the cycle repeated. Cousins married cousins, brothers lay with sisters. It was no longer an unspoken pact, but an inherited law. To them, this was not shameful, it was tradition. This is how rot disguises itself as heritage. The family convinced itself that outsiders were the enemy, that the world beyond their borders would only mock, reject, or destroy them. And in a way, they were right. For when the story finally broke into daylight, society did not come to heal them, it came to dissect them. Social workers, researchers, journalists, they descended like vultures. They spoke of case studies, of scientific interest, of genetic collapse, but they did not speak of humanity. The family was reduced to an exhibit, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms and conferences. The brothers' pact had poisoned every generation that followed, and now those descendants were studied like specimens in a jar, their lives reduced to examples of what happens when blood is too pure. This is where the tragedy deepens. Because behind every report, every whispered rumor, were people, children who never chose the bed they were born into, women who were denied freedom before they could even understand the word, men who were told their only duty, as to repeat the sins of their fathers. It was not just a story of inbreeding, it was a story of captivity, of silence, of a family cut off until all that remained was the echo of its own decay. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Most people would have turned away by now, unwilling to stare into the abyss of what family can become when isolation turns inward. But you're here. So tell me this, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, or would you have broken the cycle? Leave your answer in the comments below, because silence is what allowed this story to live as long as it did. When the truth finally could no longer be denied, when newspapers printed headlines that hinted at a family apart from the world, and doctors whispered of deformities too precise to ignore, the story shifted from silence to spectacle. But exposure is not the same as salvation. By then, the damage had been etched into the family's very DNA. The descendants bore the scars of choices made decades before they were born, scars that no medicine could erase, no reform could undo. The brothers had long since gone to their graves, their secret buried with them. The sister, whose life had been carved apart by the men who claimed to protect her, was remembered by few. But her ghost lived on in every hollow face, every wandering gaze, every child who grew up in a world that was already broken before they took their first breath. She was not forgotten by those who came after. She was carried in their bodies, in their minds, in their fate. What is most disturbing is how ordinary it seemed to those who lived it. To them, there was no horror, no crime, only survival. The outside world saw deformity, decay, a cautionary tale. But inside the family, it was simply life. A life where brother and sister, father and uncle, mother and aunt, all blended into one. Blood had lost its meaning, and with it, so had identity. The community that once stayed silent tried too late to distance itself. They called the family cursed, godless, monstrous. But these judgments came after years, decades, of looking away. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Evil rarely thrives in isolation alone. It thrives in silence, in neighbors who choose not to see, in churches that prefer to preach forgiveness rather than confrontation, in towns that whisper but never intervene. This family did not simply destroy itself, it was allowed to destroy itself. Every generation was another reminder of what happens when no one is willing to speak. The past is not a distant shadow, it bleeds forward, it demands a witness, and in telling their story, you become that witness, forced to confront not only their horror but the silence that fed it. And so we arrive at the ending, though it is not truly an ending at all. The bloodline itself has withered, fractured under the weight of its own collapse. Few remain, and those who do carry not only the physical burden, but the unbearable knowledge of what made them. A family tree so tightly wound upon itself that it strangled every branch, every leaf, every possibility of something new. What began as a pact between two brothers and their sister became a legacy of shame, whispered in hushed tones by outsiders and dissected by historians who could barely put words to what they uncovered. The newspapers and the doctors could catalogue their deformities, but they could never catalogue their suffering. They could never capture the silence in that cabin, the hollow eyes of a girl who was never allowed to be anything but a vessel, the cries of children born already broken by choices not their own. There is a cruelty in the way time remembers. Families like this are not granted the dignity of forgetting. They become stories, case studies, cautionary tales told in classrooms and over coffee, stripped of names, stripped of humanity. And yet, in that reduction, the horror deepens. Because when we speak of them, we are forced to look at the truth that most refuse to face. The line between family and prison is thinner than we care to admit. This story is not just about one sister, two brothers, or the bed they shared. It is about what isolation can do when combined with silence. It is about the danger of secrets and the price paid when shame is buried rather than confronted. And it is about us, the ones who listen, who watch, who read, because the past is never truly past. It clings, it waits, it warns. So when you leave this story tonight, do not leave it thinking it belongs only to them. Think of the silences in your own life, in your own community, in your own bloodline. There's ink of the things unspoken, the truths avoided, because history has shown again and again that what is left unspoken always grows louder in the end, and the most haunting stories are the ones that were allowed to happen in silence.